welcome to Undercover, the show that looks between the covers of books and writings by local Missoula area authors. My name is Dave Pauli, and I'm director of the Missoula Public Library. And this show is jointly produced by the Public Library and Fact and Fiction Bookstore. We have a rather different slant on things for this evening's show. I'd like to welcome our guest, Dennis Held. Welcome, Dennis.
Thanks, Dave. Nice to be here.
Dennis is the co-editor of a publication called Cutbank. Why don't you hold that up so people can get a look at that? And Cutbank is a literary magazine put out by the University of Montana. Has rather interesting entries, poetry, fiction. I'm going to let Dennis tell you a little bit more about that, but I wonder, Dennis, if you could just explain a little bit about Cutbank, how it got its start, how it's supported, just a little bit about what kind of a publication this is.
Sure, Dave. Cutbank's got a long and illustrious history as far as publishing Montana writers and Missoula writers in particular. It was founded in 1973 by William Kittredge, who still teaches at the university, teaches writing, and David Long, who was then a student and is now a local author. He lives up in Kalispell with 2 books of short stories, Home Fires and The Flood of '64. And they started it up as a sort of student-run publication to try and provide a place for people who have writings around the Missoula area, and especially for students. And it grew into, in fact, what has become one of the more well-respected national literary magazines around. So it's come a long way from where it's been, and it's had, as most magazines do, goes through periods of different editors, and so it's had different sorts of focuses to it. But it's always been a University of Montana publication, and it's always been interested in producing work by Montana writers. As far as funding the magazine goes, one of the reasons that Peter Fung, the co-editor, and I have tried to put a more local slant to the magazine with this, Cutbank 36 was the first issue we worked on, is that it's funded by ASUM, the Associated Students of University of Montana. So much of the operating money for the magazine comes from student funds. It's about $75 a quarter of what a student pays in their tuition gets set aside, and then that money all gets distributed to student organizations. So we get a small share of that money. And we worked hard, especially in this issue, to make the magazine a place where student writers would feel they could get their work published and to get more students involved. So the magazine has really 2 different kinds of things that it does. One is it provides a nice, entertaining literary magazine for people to look at. And it provides a place for Montana area writers to get their work read in a wider audience. And it also provides people who go to school at UM a kind of a laboratory where they can work on a literary magazine. There's a lot of different jobs involved. We have Peter Fung and I are co-editors, and we have a poetry editor and a fiction editor, and then there's a board of readers who go through the manuscripts and help us decide what goes in.
And who are the readers, for example? Those students that
yeah, everybody that was involved in the magazine has been students, and we worked hard to try and get more students involved in some of the other aspects of the magazine. There's a lot of just sort of typesetting and answering the mail sorts of work too that are important to running a magazine like a business, which is what we're very interested in, making the magazine more of a straightforward business than it had been. So we got, I think there were about 35 students directly involved with the production of this issue, and I think they did a good job.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive literary magazine. Well, when you get manuscripts, what kind of things are you as editors looking for? And that's my first question. This is a 2-part question. What are you looking for? And then what audience are you hoping to reach?
Well, it's amazing what comes in over the transom to a magazine that solicits manuscripts from nationwide. Really, we get more manuscripts from far afield than we do from Montana as far as just numbers go. Yeah, I just looked at the mail today and I saw we have manuscripts in from Oregon and from New York, and a lot of it is people who are in creative writing programs, but a lot of people who teach creative writing also send us manuscripts. What we're looking for at the base is just good writing. And you know, everybody's got a little bit of a different idea of what makes good writing, but Peter Fong and I sort of agreed that there were certain qualities that we looked for, and it's as much what we weren't looking for as what we were looking for. Some of the stuff that comes in is sexist or is racist, and often unintentionally, but we pretty much out of hand can dismiss that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Personally, what I like in a story or a poem is sort of straightforward approach. I don't like to have to try and figure out what the thing is about. I like to get something out of it at the first read, which I think goes well with what Cutbank has been in the past. It's high literary quality, but it's not the sort of floaty, effusive stuff that you might get elsewhere. So that's some of the sorts of things we were looking for. We also like to try and get a range. You know, if we have too many stories, for instance, that sort of have the same sound, the same voice to the narrator, that can make a magazine a little dull. So we included stories. We have one story by a UM undergraduate, which is an excellent piece of work, and we didn't have to lower our standards at all to include it. We were happy to get a good story from an undergraduate. And we have a story from a UM graduate, and a story from a woman it's her first story published, and it's from Nebraska. And then a piece of nonfiction from Bill Kittredge, a memoir. Mm-hmm. And each story has a little bit different kind of a feel to it, I think, and that's something we were looking for. And the same with the poems. Peter actually didn't work on picking the poems. He worked on the fiction board, and I worked on the poetry board primarily. But we found that we were picking a lot of poems that had similar subject matter or had a similar style of presentation. Mm-hmm. So we included a poem by a woman named Skylar Lovelace called Vacuuming Kansas. It's just kind of out there a little bit, you know, but it's a real interesting poem, and it's still great reading, you know. It's wonderful stuff to read. So that's pretty much what we're looking for. Mm-hmm. You know.
And so it isn't really what we're talking about here is a publication that's so much focused regionally. I mean, if you're publishing material from people all over the country, they aren't all set in Montana or even this part of the country necessarily.
No,
they don't.
In fact, we wound up sort of having to look at what we had to try and include a poem that was set in Montana, specifically, you know. We really try not to worry too much about content as far as where the setting of the piece is. Again, we looked through hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts. For short stories, I'm sure we looked at well over 200. And at the very most, probably 30 or 40 of those came from Montana. And of those, maybe 5 or 6 were set in Montana. So that isn't really a final consideration or even a major consideration. We look for what we think is the best writing, something that people will read. And in answer to the second part of that question, part of that is because we're sending these magazines out nationally. We have 3 distributors, an East Coast distributor, a Midwest distributor, and a West Coast distributor, who sell the magazines to bookstores across the country. A lot of university bookstores. And then some people request the magazine, people who have seen it elsewhere. And around town, we just do our own distribution by taking it around to the various bookstores in town, and we find we've had a real good response to this magazine. Peter and I both have gotten phone calls at home from people who just said, "Hey, I just wanted to tell you that we liked the new look of Cutbank." So that was real rewarding after all that work.
That's great.
Yeah.
And what about the people who submit works to a magazine like Cutbank or other literary type of magazine that's published by a university? Would they tend to be writers who are looking to get their first story published, or are they established people, or what?
It's everything. We get a range. This Cutbank magazine has been fortunate to get work from people who have a number of books out, and Margaret Alschwede, the woman from Nebraska, who sent us a short story. It's her first story published. So it's really people from all different walks of life and all different levels of having been published before. So You know, we don't look really at cover letters so much as to where they've been published or anything. We set them aside and then read the manuscripts and then go back and see. And it's interesting because many of the people whose work we reject seem to have been published quite a bit. And some of the people whose work we accept, nobody's ever heard of them before.
So the manuscript needs to stand on its own.
Yeah, it really does. It really does. And once what happens in the review process is that the fiction editor and the poetry editor look at every manuscript that comes in, and they decide which manuscripts are going to be read by the entire board.
Okay.
And the board of readers for poetry, there were 8 of us, and for fiction, I think there were 11. So, and in order for a manuscript to get chosen, it has to first be chosen by the major editor, and then it's got to be passed by at least a majority, of the people who are on the reading board. And everyone gets a chance to look at the manuscripts that didn't make the first cut, that the poetry or fiction editor didn't take. So if there's something in there that they like, they'll pull it out and have the whole board take a look at it. And then it gets fun. Then it gets a little bit exciting because everybody's got their favorites and everybody has their tastes. And so we go through and make a pile of maybes and a pile of no's. We don't make any yeses at first. And so then we have long 6-8 hour meetings where we hash it out. And then the last meeting we know about how many works the magazine will fit. And then we say, all right, what are the yeses and what are the no's? There's no more maybe land. And people argue strongly for what they want to see in the magazine, and everybody gets a chance to have their opinions heard. And sometimes, I know myself as a reader, I read past something. I read a poem and it just didn't strike me. And if you're reading over 100 poems, for instance, in the course of reviewing manuscripts, it's easy for a good one to slip by you. And then somebody say, wait a minute, you can't let this one go. This is a great piece. And so then I'll look at it again, and then we'll go through the process again. And then we wound up with our final selections.
So having a number of people involved is really helpful.
It is. For one thing, it takes some of the pressure off of having to make those kinds of decisions, which are important to people. Now, I know I'm primarily a poet. I write some short stories too, and when I send something out and it comes back rejected, it hurts, And even when we write a nice handwritten rejection letter to someone whose work came close, you know that it's going to be a little stinging for that person. So. It helps me to know that a number of other eyes have looked at this work and that we've come to some sort of consensus on it.
So do you respond to everybody who submits something, or do you try to respond?
Well, when we make we look at the first batch, there's usually over 100 short stories. And a number of those get rejected pretty summarily, out of hand. And we write sorry on the rejection letter, and we try to be, try to make the rejection letter as nice as possible. But the strict volume that we get dictates that we have to move kind of quickly through some of them. But anything that makes the first cut, and that's most of the stuff, gets a handwritten note. And if someone particularly liked it and it didn't get into the magazine, for instance, there were a couple of pieces that I would have really liked to see in there, but they didn't get it. I'll sit down and write the personal letter and tell them what I thought about it and ask them to resubmit. And, hopefully they will. And most people who send out understand that there's just hundreds of things to look at, and it's awfully hard to land something.
Well, as I was reading through some of the issues, I found some short stories that really caught my interest and attention, but it occurred to me that perhaps the short story isn't as widely read by the public as it used to be. And I got to thinking about being a kid in the 50s and Saturday Evening Post and every one of the popular magazines that my parents subscribed to had a lot of short stories by really well-known authors. I mean, I can remember reading John O'Hara stories in the Saturday Evening Post. Is that perception of mine correct or not, that people aren't reading as many short stories and they aren't published as widely as they used to be?
Well, part of it is the simple demographics of magazine distribution. A lot of those general issue magazines have simply gone out of business.
Right.
And so some of the markets have dried up. I think actually now it's beginning to come back quite a bit, and there's a renewed interest in the short story. I would say within the last 5 or 10 years in particular. And I would point to, for instance, the O. Henry Award winners. The subscription for those kinds of collected stories are going up. And there's other magazines and collections, Pushcart Prize winners, for instance. There's more venues for short stories. The short story form has taken a kind of a turn, too, in the last 5 years or so toward much shorter stories. And there's an anthology called Sudden Fiction, which published quite a number of the stories. It's one benefit. A book that big, you can have 300 stories in it.
Yeah.
And so there's a real it's actually renewed interest, because there was a time when shorter stories were more popular, but now there are a lot of venues for those kinds of stories. And I think it's getting a little easier to publish a short story, and they're out there for people to read. You may have to look a little harder. I think you're right. But magazine publishing, the whole magazine industry has changed, popular magazine in particular. And I think that has had a great effect on the short story venues, just the kinds of places that you can read them.
Well, what about the short story as a literary form in general? Is there something particular that you would look for the format or the form, or is it just, isn't there anything standard about a short story that's a good one? What makes a good one? Is there an answer to that question?
Well, I guess every editor's got a different answer to what makes a good story. I like stories that are understated, I guess, is a way to put it. And David Long is a good example. I don't need a train wreck every 4 pages in a story. I like stories that take a little while to unfold sometimes. I like stories that have small moments in people's lives clearly illuminated. Because a lot of times you see a story and people think that somebody's got to come running in with machine guns to the diner and blow the place up in order for it to be interesting. And I think that's underrating your reader. I think most people realize that our lives don't often have terrorists running in machine guns, and that we do go through significant changes, but they're often brought about in small increments. And stories that can do that, they're awfully hard to write. That somebody walking down the street and sort of their everyday life, and then a moment of illumination or something. It's much harder to catch and maintain a reader's interest with that kind of story. So how that happens for me often, in the case of the stories in here, there's a story called Hardware by Mark Elling, the undergraduate, where there's thematic things going on that are shown through not necessarily symbols, but what's going on in the story sort of reinforces what's going on thematically. In that story, it's a first-person story. The narrator is telling you about it. And he's got a rat tail file, which is this round file, and he's filing holes out in this story. And he slowly reveals to the reader that things are not well in his relationship with his father especially. And the filing sort of is a metaphor for what's going on elsewhere in the story. But it's really understated, it's really underplayed. And it's beautifully done. You get done reading that story, at least I did, and I had tears in my eyes. I just, whoa, And you don't often, the first reading, you don't know why. A really good story or a good poem works its magic on you without lots of flash and dazzle. And those are stories that I'm beginning to see more of, and that I enjoy, and that I argue for the magazine. And the same with poems. Greg Pape, for example, who teaches at the university, has poems in here, one of which, Wajiji, won the Dick Hugo Memorial Award. And it's a very straightforward presentation. Often in poems that I had read when I first started writing poetry, things are not as they seem, and you don't know quite what to expect. And sometimes that works, but it isn't the only way to go about it. Often a straightforward, quiet voice telling you a little story, and then a turn at the end toward greater understanding, toward greater illumination through the language. Real interesting use of language, but still in a straightforward way. So those are kinds of things I like to see.
Well, let's see. What about the whole question of the bad driving out the good? I mean, obviously, as a director of a public library, we see an awful lot of pretty mediocre fiction that we have to buy because of public demand. I mean, do you feel that that there is less of a place for really good writing now than there used to be, or not?
I don't know. I'm optimistic by nature. I mean, that's just part of my personality. So maybe I'm not the right person to ask, but I think good writing will last and will rise up above other kinds of writing, shall we say. And I sure see a heck of a lot of good writing around. You may have to look at it harder. You may have to go to different places to find it. But I think, for instance, if I came to the library and wasn't sure and I asked you about it, I bet you could show me some good writing. And I'm not so sure that the bad is driving it out. I don't really think, I don't know. I don't think that's the case.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how, major publishers seem to be going more and more toward these massive blockbuster novels. I'm wondering if people who might have a somewhat smaller market for their writing are getting squeezed out of publishing in that way.
They may be getting squeezed out of the major houses. As you know, the major factor in publishing in the last 10 years has been that many of the publishing houses have merged through acquisitions. Some what were formerly small houses that were willing to take a chance on something that maybe wouldn't have that commercial appeal but had great literary value. Some of those kinds of publishing venues are drying up because of those kinds of megalithic corporations. Mm-hmm. And I think it's true that the major houses more and more feel like they need to see 100,000 copies sold before they're willing to take a chance. The upside of that is, and again, this may just be my way of looking at the world that sees things a little rosier than it is, but there are a number of small presses that seem to have slipped in to fill the gap. Grey Wolf Press is doing great things. I see North Point Press, unfortunately, is not going to be publishing new titles. That's a recent announcement. And that's a loss because they publish wonderful books. But Godine does great work. There are a lot of small presses around. And there's a lot of small magazines like Cutbank around for people to get their foot in the door and get a start. A real problem is that the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, used to fund a lot of publishing ventures which they no longer fund. The Illinois Short Fiction Series just this year was cut, and a lot of great short stories were published in that series. So that's going to be, that may be a problem with the NEA. But I don't know. Again, I think there's new things coming up to take the place.
Glad to hear that.
Yeah, publishing is becoming, through desktop publishing, it's in the range of more people financially than it ever was. This magazine was phototype set, and we did everything pretty much through desktop, and helped us keep our costs down and get more magazines published for the same price. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Well, I've touched on this next question with other people who've been guests on this show. I just wonder what you think about it. Montana seems to be a very fertile ground for writers. Why do you think that is? You wouldn't necessarily, I think nationally people don't necessarily think of Montana immediately as a, but it is. There are nationally known authors here. It's wonderful.
Nationally, people are becoming aware of Montana as a breeding ground for writers. In Missoula, Lois Welch, who directs the creative writing program here at the university, got a call from USA Today just yesterday asking, what's going on in Missoula? Why are all these writers here? As far as Missoula goes, there's a long-standing tradition of good writing here, much of which comes out of the university. James Welch was a student of Dick Hugo's, and now he's, it's very well known how his success. So I think that it builds on that sort of a tradition, that sort of past. Also, Missoula in particular and Montana in general are great places to live. And people come through the program here and they want to stay here, and they're willing to work for less. One thing about writing is that you aren't necessarily tied to a factory or some sort of industry where you need to be 30 minutes away. Many people who live and write in Montana send their manuscripts off to New York and they can write at home. So I think that's a factor. People that want to live in the quality of life that you can get around here and are able to do so because writing is the sort of vocation that allows that.
Right. Well, I want to thank you, Dennis, for being our guest. Dennis Held is the co-editor of the literary magazine Cutbank, published by the University of Montana. I find some fascinating writing in there. And I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about things that are happening at the library. First, I want to say thank you to the folks who supported our most wonderfully successful summer reading program for children. The Dairy Queen, the Good Food Store, our friends at Fact and Fiction Bookstore and Great Northern Bookstore, and also the Friends of the Missoula Public Library. This fall we'll be having a series of story times starting September 10th and running through November 15th. We have an evening one on Tuesdays at 7 o'clock, an afternoon one on Thursdays at 1:30, and at Friday a morning one, 10:30 a.m. So those are for preschoolers, kids through 5 years of age. And you can come to an evening, morning, or afternoon, whichever suits your particular schedule. Also, our Book Babies program for parents and infants is continuing on the first Wednesday at 7 o'clock. We'll also be reestablishing our group called the Club for Middle Schoolers this fall, and you can call the library and talk to Karen or Betty about that program. I'd also like to note that the library will be having a series of book discussions that are funded through the Montana Humanities Committee. Those are ongoing right now, and unfortunately we're just about all full. We have no room for anyone else, but I'm hoping we can continue book discussion group past the time that this particular series finishes up in March. And if you have any interest in being part of that, I urge you to call me down at the library. Our number is 721-2665. And as a final reminder, I'd like to let people know that our year-round hours, no change, summer to winter, our year-round hours are Monday through Thursday, 10 in the morning till 9 in the evening, and Friday and Saturday, 10 in the morning until 6 in the evening. And we're very fortunate that we have been able to stay open those hours, and we really want to thank the county commissioners in particular this year for seeing fit to fund us at a little better level than we have been funded in the past. So again, we have convenient hours, evenings, and we're open every Saturday. If you have any questions about any of the programs going on at the library, again, be sure and call us at 721-BOOK, 721-2665. And again, I want to thank Dennis Held, who's been our guest here, and who is the co-editor of the publication Cutbank.